So, it's official now. The ANC has gone to bed with the DA to constitute government. But here is the irony though. The ANC says that it doesn't want Nelson Chamisa to lead Zimbabwe because he represents white people and a neo-colonialist agenda. Yet, the ANC itself is just now forming government with an elitist right-wing political party that is led by white people. What hypocrisy! This just goes to show how dirty politics can be. Don't believe everything that these politicians tell you. There are no eternal friends or perpetual enemies in politics. All you have are permanent interests, but even the interests themselves are not that permanent. They change more often than you realize. So you owe it to yourself to stay informed. After all, how can you make a proper decision on who to vote for if you're not properly and sufficiently informed? Think for yourself and question everything. We need a new breed of young African people who prioritize bread and butter issues over political affiliation. It's the only way we're going to hold these politicians to account for their actions. If you love your political party more than your country, you will follow your political leader to the abyss, to Gehenna, to hell. So we need young, bold, Pan-African and diligent Africans whose love for their country far outweighs their loyalty to political parties and transcends beyond ethnic boundaries, race, tribe, and religion. Fellow Sadza eaters, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasnamalites, varikudya rice, never snama rice. Welcome to the special report. Today, we want to take a closer look at the next government of South Africa and some of the things to expect. Now, given that 90% of my subscribers are Zimbabwean, I know some of them will probably say, why should we care about what happens in South Africa? Well, thank you very much for asking. Now, sit down and let me furnish you with the details. You see, whether you like it or not, what happens in South Africa affects Zimbabwe directly and indirectly. South Africa is not only Zimbabwe's biggest trading partner, it's also the biggest reason why Zimbabwe remains standing economically and politically. South Africa is the warehouse of Zimbabwe, the pharmacy of Zimbabwe, the surgical theater of Zimbabwe, the general hospital of Zimbabweans. Millions of livelihoods in Zimbabwe are sustained by incomes of Zimbabweans living and working in South Africa. In fact, in 2022, Zimstat estimated that there are close to 800,000 Zimbabweans living in South Africa. Of course, that was a conservative estimate. The actual figure could be well over 1 million. So, indeed, you should care about what happens in South Africa. The stability of South Africa directly affects the stability of Zimbabwe. See, the stability of Zimbabwe is hinged to the stability of South Africa. The foreign policy of South Africa directly affects Zimbabwe, especially now that there is a coalition government which will include the DA, which is vehemently opposed to the ZANU-PF government. So, now that Ramaphosa has been duly elected, he must be sworn in within 5 days and then name his cabinet. As I said 2 weeks ago, ZANU-PF will be hoping that the ANC doesn't give up key strategic ministries which will affect South Africa's geopolitical interests, because that would be disastrous for Mbuyananda's party. You see, South Africa is not Zambia. So President Mnangagwa can't go to Russia and do to South Africa what he did to the Zambians by casually attacking their foreign policy. That will be political suicide for ED. Because you see, if the SADC region was a solar system, then South Africa would be the sun S-U-N, sun. And the rest of the SADC countries would be planets orbiting South Africa, the sun. Now, if you understand physics, that should give you a better impression and understanding of how influential South Africa is in the region from a geopolitical standpoint. Economically speaking, the economy of South Africa is 2 times bigger than all the SADC countries put together. South Africa is the exemplification of Stana's statement. We lead, others follow. South Africa has always been a giant since the establishment of white civilization in Africa. In fact, from the early 80s, the establishment of SADC was meant to reduce the over-reliance, over-dependence of Southern African countries on apartheid South Africa. And so, over the years, many Southern African countries have made great strides in reducing their dependence on South Africa. But sadly, Zimbabwe remains heavily dependent on Mzansi. Before 1994, Zimbabwe was dependent on South Africa economically. But nowadays, Zimbabwe is not only heavily dependent on South Africa economically, it's also heavily dependent politically. And that is why the inclusion of the DA in South Africa's next government is disastrous for ZANU-PF, because the DA vehemently opposes ZANU-PF. Now, given how well the DA did in outperforming all the other opposition parties, one should think that the DA will have a sizable representation in the government of national unity. But of course, for this government to be a true GNU, it will need more political parties to join it. Otherwise, in reality, it will just be an ANC big tent coalition. You see, a government of national unity in its traditional meaning must incorporate most political parties that have a representation in parliament. And in some instances, as in the case of Zimbabwe, from 2009 to 2013, a government of national unity can incorporate all the parties in parliament. So that means from 2009 to 2013, Zimbabwe didn't have an opposition party in parliament because the 2 opposing parties, the MDCT and the MDCM, joined ZANU-PF in creating a government of national unity. So prior to this, the only other time Zimbabwe came mind-numbingly close to having no opposition party in parliament was in 1995, when Ndabaningistole ZANU-Ndonga won 2 seats out of 120. ZANU-PF took the rest of the seats. So that means Ndabaningistole ZANU-Ndonga single-handedly stopped Zimbabwe from being a one-party state. Let that sink in. Remember, ZAPU and ZANU had resolved to turn Zimbabwe into a one-party state after the 1987 Unity Accord. Thank you, Ndabaningistole. But of course, South Africa is no stranger to the idea of a government of national unity. The very first government of independent South Africa in 1994 was a government of national unity. You see, the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990 gave rise to the formulation of a roadmap to majority rule. This culminated in the CODESA talks and the multiple party negotiating process, which gave birth to the interim constitution of 1993. This interim constitution was the midwife of South Africa's democratic regime. Clause 88 of this interim constitution provided for the establishment of a government of national unity soon after the 1994 elections. So the purpose of this government of national unity was to oversee the crafting of a new democratic, non-discriminatory constitution of South Africa. So, even though the ANC won the 1994 elections by over 60%, it was still bound by the interim constitution to create a government of national unity. So therefore, it's very important to note the distinction. In 1994, the ANC didn't need a coalition to govern. They had a majority in parliament. Now, that GNU in 1994 was a constitutional requirement. The GNU in 2024 is born out of the fact that the ANC doesn't have sufficient numbers to govern alone. So the ANC depends on its coalition partners for not only the success of this government, but also its very life, its very oxygen. Speaking of this oxygen, I can already smell some carbon dioxide coming out of this government by osmosis, crossing over the Limpopo River by diffusion, oozing adiabatically to suffocate a certain revolutionary party. So, can the ANC govern alone? Yes, theoretically they can, but practically they can't. Because you can form a minority government provided you have the confidence of parliament. Now, given the volatility of the current South African parliament, that is a non-starter. Already, the EFF has submitted a draft resolution for a motion of impeachment against Ramaphosa. Of course, without the ANC, the South African parliament doesn't have the required two-thirds majority to impeach Ramaphosa. The ANC has 159 seats. The rest of the parties combined have 241 seats. You need 267 seats to form a two-thirds majority required to impeach the president. And for those who might not know, impeaching a president simply means removing a president from office because of serious misconduct, violating the constitution, or incapacity. Many of you remember that in 2017, the Zimbabwean parliament initiated an impeachment process against former president, the late Robert Mugabe, during the coup days. In fact, the Zimbabwean Speaker of Parliament, Jacob Mudenda, had to stop the impeachment proceedings in order to read Robert Mugabe's resignation letter. But anyway, the point I was making is that the current South African Parliament needs ANC MPs in order to impeach Ramaphosa. Without the cooperation of ANC MPs, Ramaphosa can't be impeached. But of course, impeachment is not the only way to remove a South African president. There are two ways in which a South African president can be removed from office. Number one, impeachment. Number two, a motion of no confidence. An impeachment process requires a two-thirds majority in parliament, but a motion of no confidence simply requires a majority, not expressly a two-thirds majority. So that means Ramaphosa can easily be removed by a motion of no confidence. And that means Ramaphosa is literally living on a knife edge. That's what we mean when we say it's no longer completely up to the ANC. And this is unprecedented. At any time, Ramaphosa can be unprecedented. I just invented that word. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.